They came after me because of the smell of fresh bread. Let that sink in. Not long ago, I received a letter from my HOA demanding more than $350,000 for odor pollution and other supposed infractions. At first, I thought it was some twisted joke or a mix-up in the paperwork, but the harder I pushed back, the stranger things became. Neighbors who once waved now avoided me. Strange cars cruised my street at odd hours. One evening, someone even left a smashed loaf of bread on my doorstep. Something was definitely off in this neighborhood. I was fined hundreds of thousands of dollars for baking bread on my own property, but what I discovered beneath their houses is what truly ignited the fire. My name's Henry Blake, 32 years old. And I guess you could say I made a choice most people would call reckless. My family runs Blake Real Estate, one of the biggest firms in downtown Sacramento. I was expected to inherit the business, dress in tailored suits, and rake in millions flipping high-end properties. Instead, I bought a small farm in Millbrook Heights and became a baker. I've always preferred working with my hands. When I found this patch of paradisey rolling hills, golden sunlight filtering through ancient oaks, I knew I had to make it mine. The previous owner, a kind elderly man who'd been there for 4 decades, handed me the keys with tears in his eyes. He said he was glad someone young would breathe new life into the place. I spent months restoring the farmhouse and converting the back barn into a commercial kitchen. I got every necessary permit, passed all health inspections, and did everything by the book. Most neighbors seemed pleased as well, almost all. Annie Henderson, a warm-hearted 70-year-old who lived next door, became my first loyal customer. Every Tuesday, she'd drop by for a dozen croissants for her grandchildren. We'd sit on my porch, sipping coffee, talking about her late husband's garden and my dreams of growing the bakery. Annie had lived in Millbrook Heights for 30 years, so she knew every face and every secret. But then there was Stella Crania, around 50. Silver hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. She carried a pricey Parker pen everywhere like it was a badge of authority. As HOA president and a former CFO of a failed real estate corporation, she had a reputation. I'd heard whispers that she'd pushed several families out of their homes over petty violations of wrong mailbox colors, cars parked a couple inches past the driveway line. The first time she saw my bakery, her face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon. She marched up to my door, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 silent neighbors standing like jury members. She looked me over with the expression of someone inspecting gum on their shoe. "Mr. Blake," she said in a voice cold enough to frost glass, "we need to address some concerns about your activities." The way she said activities made it sound like I was running a smuggling ring instead of baking bread. I offered her coffee, showed her my permits, health certificate, Tessa, everything. She wasn't impressed. Standing in my kitchen, she sneered and told me Millbrook Heights had certain standards, and that my bakery violated multiple HOA bylaws. Then she started snapping pictures of my kitchen, the permits, even my equipment through the window. But here's what burned me. I had read the HOA rules cover to cover before buying the property. Home businesses were allowed if licensed, and I had every license. I showed her the exact clause, but she just smiled a cold, knowing smiley and said, "We'll see about that." Then she turned and left, her 2 companions dispersing like chess pieces retreating to their squares. A couple of weeks later, the notice came: $350,000 in fines for commercial odor pollution, improper vehicles, and unauthorized home business operations. My name was clearly printed at the top, no mistake. It was absurd. Odor pollution? I was baking bread, not manufacturing toxic waste. If I didn't pay in 30 days, they'd put a lien on my property. That's when Annie knocked on my door. One look at me and she knew something was wrong. I showed her the notice, and she shook her head with a mix of anger and a broken bar of fear. "Henry," she said, sinking into a chair, "there's something you need to know about Stella and this property." Annie wasn't just a customer, she was the first person who believed my bakery could bring something special to the community. Then she told me something that chilled my blood. "I lost my husband's workshop to HOA fines 3 years ago," she said quietly. "Stella claimed the woodworking violated noise rules. We had to sell part of our land to pay the penalties." That was the moment I knew there was no backing down. Annie went on, "Before you bought this place, Stella made 10 offers to the old owner, each one higher than the last. He always refused. Ida said she gave him the creeps. Annie leaned in, lowering her voice. And after every rejection, another neighbor suddenly got hit with violations. This wasn't about bylaws or neighborhood pride, it was about control, intimidation, and something personal. I spread the documents across my table, comparing the fines survey to the original property records from when I first bought the land at Broken Bar. When I bought the place, I didn't expect to discover that the property lines on the official papers didn't even come close to matching the original survey. Part of me wondered if I was digging myself into something far beyond my control. Maybe the smart move would have been to call a lawyer, pay the fee, and walk away quietly. But I've never been the type to bow to bullies. The day Stella pointed to the exact square of ground where my smoker sat, she didn't realize she was pointing straight at the start of her own undoing. Instead of panicking, I decided to fight back the only way I know through bread. But this wouldn't be just any loaf. The next morning, I created what I called the justice loaf, shaped like the scales of justice with small bread weights hanging on each side. Then I pushed the idea further. I baked a gigantic version big enough to feed 50 people and set up a table right on my front lawn. By mid-morning, people weren't just stopping by to buy bread, they were there to hear my side of the story. This oven isn't just baking bread, it's baking defiance, I told them, holding up the $350,000 fine like a battle flag. The bread wasn't just food anymore, it had become a symbol. Mrs. Peterson, from a few houses down, bought 2 loaves and said she'd heard about my situation from Annie. She shook her head. $350,000 for bread? That's more than most homes here are worth. Then she lowered her voice. Henry, I don't want to be in the middle of this, but the HOA sent me a letter. They said I'd be fined if I kept buying from you. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me. The entire neighborhood was under watch, threatened, and controlled. Word was spreading fast, and whether that was good or bad didn't matter anymore. I was angry enough to keep going. When I compared the fines attached survey with my original property documents, it was like looking at 2 entirely different maps. The measurements weren't just off, they were deliberately changed. Someone had been altering the documents, and the sloppy digital fingerprints were still visible. 2 feet might not sound like much, but in real estate, 2 feet can decide whether a structure is legal or in violation. Under a magnifying glass, I saw tiny pixelated breaks along the survey line as a clear signs of tampering. When I held the paper up to the light, faint overlays revealed that text had been removed and replaced. These weren't originals, they were forged, and the edits were recent. This wasn't just a property dispute, it was calculated fraud. And I was beginning to get a very clear idea of who was behind it. Walking away would have been logical, but then I thought of Annie, and of the way Stella had looked at me like I was worth less than dirt, and something inside me hardened. This wasn't just petty HOA nonsense anymore, it felt criminal. I started making rounds through the neighborhood, paying attention to property lines for the first time. Stella's home, a Grand Colonial on the corner lot. Manicured lawns, probably worth $2 million. It looked picture perfect, but from where I sat in my truck, her back fence seemed to creep further onto my land than it should. That night, I called my old college roommate Jake, a county surveyor. I didn't want him tangled in this, so I kept my questions general, just asking about property line disputes and signs of forged surveys. He told me it happens more than people realize, especially where property values are high. A shift of even a couple feet could mean hundreds of thousands in value. If you think something's off, he said, get a licensed surveyor to redo it. It wasn't cheap, but I was already in too deep to back out. I booked Peterson Land Surveying for the following week. They promised preliminary results within 2 days of finishing the work. I marked the date and tried not to obsess over what would happen if I was wrong. Then I saw something that told me I wasn't wrong at all. While watering my vegetable garden, I noticed a water line running from Stella's property, crossing what I was almost certain was my land, before disappearing under my fence and tying into the main street supply. I wasn't an expert, but I knew you couldn't just install utilities on someone else's land without permission, and no one had ever asked mine. I traced the line, taking photos and measurements. It extended about 15 feet into the land my survey claimed was mine, connecting directly to her irrigation system. Either the property lines were completely redrawn, a broken bar, or Stella had been quietly using my land for her utilities. And given the rest of the evidence, I was leaning toward the latter. But suspicion wasn't enough anymore. I needed proof, real proof. That night, I couldn't shake Annie's words about how badly Stella had wanted this property. While sorting through a pile of old mail, I spotted something I'd tossed aside months ago: a typed offer to buy my land for an oddly precise amount. No name, just a return address I now recognized as the HOA headquarters. What if this wasn't simply about her expanding her lot? What if my land held something she specifically needed? By the early hours of the morning, I was buried in the county's online property archives, digging through decades of surveys and ownership changes. Then I found data, an original development survey from 1990. The boundaries on that map were nothing like what's currently on file. A substantial portion of the ground now claimed as Stella's had once been part of my lot. Either I was losing my mind from exhaustion, or someone had been working very hard to rewrite history. To be sure, I called an old co-worker who knew property law inside out. She confirmed the deed records I referenced had never been digitized, meaning someone had handled the paper originals. Finding a surveyor willing to take on this job proved harder than I expected. The first three either didn't return my calls or suddenly weren't available after I mentioned my address. It felt like someone was deliberately closing doors in my face. Then I reached Carol Peterson, a tough, straightforward surveyor with over 20 years of experience. When she arrived, she took one look at the documents spread across my kitchen table and frowned. "These numbers don't match county records," she said flatly. "Looks like someone's been creative with the math." Within the hour, Carol had her laser gear set up and was pacing the edges of my property. By midday, she delivered news that turned my stomach. "Mr. Blake," she said, showing me her tablet, "according to the county's own measurements and my survey, Stella Crane's mansion sits 3 feet and 2 inches onto your property." On the overlay she displayed, I could clearly see the corner of Stella's home along with her entire side patio and half her 3-car garage squarely on my land. That's around 800 square feet of illegal construction in an area where land is valued at over $1,000 per square foot. And it got worse. Carol pulled up Stella's building permits from 6 years ago. The original plans had the house positioned perfectly within her lot, but the final inspection record showed the structure shifted 3 feet into mine. "This isn't a mistake," Carol said grimly. "This is deliberate land theft." I wanted to put my fist through a wall. Instead, I baked. There's something about pounding dough that clears your head when you're furious. And as I worked, the pieces fell together: fake surveys, inflated fines, intimidation, all to push me off my land before I could uncover her scam. When I inspected the fence line again, I noticed a survey stake that had been yanked out, buried halfway, and reset 2 feet west. That afternoon, I went deeper digging into Stella's other HOA dealings. Hours of combing through public records revealed a repeating pattern: shell companies, forced sales, questionable meeting notes. I called Annie over. "Take a look at this," I told her, showing her the home minutes. "Not a single one has resident signatures." "Annie, were you ever told about these boundary changes?" She shook her head, eyes wide. "This whole neighborhood has been manipulated," I said quietly. "Everything we thought we knew about living here has been a lie." The pattern was identical every time: a family slapped with increasingly absurd violations, fines climbing to impossible amounts, then a shell company tied to Stella swooping in with a lowball offer to help them avoid foreclosure. She'd been running the same playbook for years. Stella had been quietly forcing out long-term residents, seizing their properties through what was essentially legal extortion, and I was just her latest mark. The satellite images didn't just hint at encroachment, they proved it. Her mansion stood partly on land that legally belonged to me. But here's what really set my blood boiling: every single one of these shady property transfers had involved the same surveying company that prepared the bogus map used in my fine. Precision Land Associates wasn't simply drafting inaccurate surveys, they were partners in her scheme, creating whatever paperwork she needed to justify her land grabs. The same surveyor who signed my forged map had also approved the transfers for the 3 other homes Stella had taken from families in this neighborhood. She didn't have her name on the deeds, but her presence lingered over every stolen inch, like smoke from a fire she lit years ago. This was no longer just a boundary dispute. Everything I'd worked for in my dream, my livelihood, was sitting on land someone was actively trying to steal through an organized criminal conspiracy. I wanted to rip the survey report in half. Instead, I sat at my table, staring at the evidence and weighing the future. If I kept pushing forward, I could lose everything. If I stopped, I'd have nothing left anyway. That evening, my kitchen table became a war desk. Carol's survey report, records from the shell companies, a chain of fraudulent transfers. It was all there, enough to bring down Stella's entire operation. But I knew she'd run this racket for years without being caught. That meant she likely had allies, maybe even in city government, protecting her. I thought about Annie. I thought about the families forced to sell, about the neighbors too scared to speak up. This had grown far beyond my $350,000 fine. This was about justice for an entire community. The challenge was, taking on Stella was like standing up to Goliath, except this Goliath had lawyers and a network of well-placed friends. Then a piece of advice from my grandfather floated into my head. When you're building something to last, you don't start with the trim, you start with a solid foundation. That's when I found an old newspaper clipping from the 1970s about speculative oil testing in the area. The headline claimed no commercial deposits were found. I nearly ignored data until the date clicked in my mind. Stella's empire was built on falsehoods and altered records. If I could expose her lies publicly, the entire thing could collapse on its own. I stayed up, drafting a plan. The next day, I was going to do something bold, something that could either end this nightmare or put me in serious danger. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She's done this before. You're not her first. The next morning, I started on my most ambitious project. Yet not bread, but an edible, three-dimensional map of Millbrook Heights. This wasn't just dessert, it was evidence, a weapon disguised as hospitality. Every house was sculpted from buttercream and fondant. Raspberry swirls traced zoning boundaries. Rich chocolate fudge marked the violations tied to Stella. And every illegally occupied parcel was colored in a vivid, bleeding red. I handwrote invitations for every household. Come learn the truth about your neighborhood. Refreshments provided. By Saturday afternoon, 43 people were packed into my backyard. I could see hesitation on some faces. Mrs. Stevens from a few streets over crossed her arms. We don't know if we should trust you, Henry. This isn't our fight. A few heads nodded. I realized then I'd have to prove every word. Friends and neighbors, I began, letting my voice carry over the group. What you're looking at isn't just a cakeia, it's a crime scene. I pointed to the red sections representing Stella's stolen land. Every one of these areas was taken from its rightful owner through forged surveys and fraudulent documents. The yard fell silent. People leaned closer, studying the intricate details. I walked them through it step by step of the shell companies, the fines that skyrocketed until families had no choice but to sell, the survey proving Stella's mansion sat on my land. This isn't about one bad neighbor, I said. This is organized crime operating under the cover of an HOA. The air was tense enough to snap. That's when Stella showed up. I hadn't invited her, but word travels fast here. She shoved her way through the crowd like she owned my yard, probably because she believed she did. The moment her eyes landed on my cake, her face went pale. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice just shaky enough for everyone to catch it. Henry's obviously having some kind of breakdown. You can't believe a word he's saying, she barked, but I was more than ready for this moment. Mrs. Crane, I called out so the entire crowd could hear, care to explain why your mansion stretches 3 feet onto my land without my consent? I lifted Carol's official survey report high in the air. This comes from a licensed professional. Your house, your patio, even your garagia built on land you had no right to take. I didn't need a show of hands to see the shift. Arms crossed, heads tilted, the subtle signs that her influence was slipping. She kept her composure, but she didn't dare touch the cake either. Property lines are tricky business, she tried to insist, her voice carrying a fraction of the confidence it usually did. Murmurs swept through the group as eyes darted between the cake and her paling face. Besides, she added with a thin smile, you're playing with fire here, Henry, and in this neighborhood a broken bar fire spreads fast. That's when Claire Morrison stepped forward, a late 20s, short blonde hair, And this sort of presence that told you she'd won more than her fair share of arguments. You really have no idea what Henry's cooking up, do you? Claire said, locking eyes with Stella. I think he's right. You tricked me into signing a boundary adjustment I didn't understand 2 years back. She turned to me. We can't keep ignoring this. Her words cracked something open in the crowd. Voices rose. Stories poured out, accounts of suspicious Anadromous finds, threats, and pressure to sell. Mrs. Patterson mentioned the menacing letter about buying my bread. The Martinez family shared how their kids' bikes had suddenly become an offense. One by one, the fear that kept them quiet began to dissolve. I watched Stella's face tighten. She fought to look unaffected, but her hands trembled, and she kept glancing toward the street like she was searching for an exit. This is all very interesting, she finally muttered, voice nearly hollow. But I think you'll find Anadromous regulations are perfectly clear about unauthorized gatherings like this. You know what's really interesting, Mrs. Crane? I replied, slicing the cake right through her bright red frosted mansion. I've read stories online about Anadromous corruption before. A broken bar. Never thought I'd be living one. I handed the piece to Annie in full view of everyone. This isn't just about property lines or Anadromous violations anymore, I said, sweeping my gaze over my neighbors, who good people who'd endured her intimidation for years. I've already sent all of this evidence, including the recording of Mrs. Crane's threats, to someone you absolutely don't want to cross, Stella, because I know you won't stop until you've broken everyone in your way. Her lips parted like she might argue, but instead her color drained completely. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked truly afraid. Surrounded by people she'd bullied for years, standing in front of a cake that laid bare her entire scheme, she whispered, "You don't know what you're getting into. You have no idea who you are dealing with, a broken bar, or what this will cost you." I just smiled and took another bite. Actually, Mrs. Crane, I know exactly who I am dealing with. The question Isa broken barred you. As she turned away, I caught her low words to her assistant. Start the countermeasures. He's gone public. I didn't yet know what it meant, but I heard every word. I waited precisely 48 hours before playing my final movie, and not out of fear, but to see how many tricks she'd try first. During those 2 days, she drove past my house again and again, clearly trying to guess the extent of my evidence. An unmarked envelope appeared on my porch containing a burned, shredded photo of my cake. But intimidation was no longer her winning strategy. The rules had changed, and she didn't know the new game. By Tuesday morning, I was ready. I invited everyone back to my place. This time a broken bar. I set up nothing more than a plain folding table in my front yard, a small Bluetooth speaker perched on top. No cake this time, just the unvarnished truth. When about 30 neighbors had gathered, Stella included, showing up uninvited yet again, I pressed play on my phone. Her voice blared into the morning air. Just pressure him with fines until he's forced to sell the house. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. A chair scraped against the pavement. A coffee mug shattered on the sidewalk. Every word came from a recording I'd made in my kitchen. Stella's tone cold and smug. These people think they can waltz into our neighborhood and change things. They need to learn their place. Faces in the crowd shifted from mild curiosity to shock, then hardened into fury. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Davidson shot to his feet so quickly his chair toppled. Claire Morrison's jaw set like she was ready for battle. The second clip needed no introduction. Stella's voice again, this time on the phone with someone from her phony surveying company. I don't care what the actual property lines are, just make the paperwork say what I want. Then another damning snippet, her calmly explaining a plan to use shell companies to buy out problem families at rock-bottom prices. Every new revelation made the picture clearer, a long-running scheme of fraud and manipulation inside our Anadromous nest, designed to steal homes without ever lifting a shovel. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if taking her bribe would have been easier than exposing all of this. But looking at my neighbors' faces, I knew I'd chosen right. Stella's complexion had gone from pale to ashen to something almost green. "Those recordings are illegal," she whispered. "You can't use them." I smiled. "In this state, you only need one voice to burn a liar, and mine's plenty loud." The crowd murmured their approval, and I saw people instinctively taking a step back from her. as if standing too close might be contagious. Then I produced a manila envelope and held it up. Here's the return receipt from the FBI field office in Sacramento. 3 days ago, I sent them every recording, Carol's survey report, and the evidence of your shell company scam, wire fraud, mail fraud, forged land records. These aren't just Anna Drama-nest issues, Stella, they're federal crimes. Her face drained completely of color. I pulled out another envelope. I also sent everything to the county prosecutor and the State Bar Association. From the crowd, Mrs. Carol Stevenson, who had once told me I was overreacting, stood and spoke with a trembling voice. I was one of the people who signed the penalty letter against Henry. I'm sorry. I never knew I was helping someone like this. She turned toward Stella. How could you make us accomplices to your crimes? Someone slipped quietly out the back gate, too ashamed to be seen. Turns out the FBI had already been looking into similar schemes in 3 other neighborhoods. Stella wasn't just a manipulator, she was a career land thief. Every community, the same method, fake boundary changes, neighbors unwittingly drawn into her plans, property stolen without a single bulldozer in sight. The crowd went still when I finished explaining. You could see the same thought written on everyone's face. How long have we been living next to a criminal mastermind? Annie took my hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. And then, the final blow. The community has voted to remove you from the Anna Drama-nest board immediately, I announced. Claire helped me organize a special session last night, recorded everything, and filed it with the county this morning. You're no longer president, Mrs. Crane. In fact, you're permanently banned from serving on the board in any capacity. Even Dennis Matthews, from 3 streets over, shifted awkwardly and mumbled about due process. Stella tried one last desperate play, but I cut her off. You tried to evict a man who bakes bread, I said. What you didn't realize is my oven's also a furnace. It didn't matter anymore. Her reign was over. The woman who had terrorized our Anna Drama-nest for years stood exposed as nothing more than a criminal, with nowhere left to hide. Actually, Mrs. Crane, I said, this is over. The only question is whether you walk away now or wait for the FBI to collect you. She chose to walk away, more like stumbly, to her car, and drove off, likely for the last time. The crowd stayed another hour, swapping stories of the abuse they'd endured under her rule, stories they'd been too afraid to tell until now. Some of my neighbors finally began sharing stories they'd been too afraid to tell before. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. Little did I know, though, that this was only the beginning of Stella's real downfall. Watching someone's entire world collapse in front of them is both unsettling and, in this case, deeply satisfying. Once the FBI had my evidence, they wasted no time. Stella's accounts were frozen. Records from Precision Land Associates were seized, and similar scams in other neighborhoods came under investigation. It turned out my situation was far from rare. Stella had been pulling versions of this same scheme for years. I was simply the first person who fought back without flinching. When the federal agents called to thank me for cooperating, they said something that made my stomach turn. She's setting fire to the field you're standing in. I understood that her destruction wasn't over yet. The legal wheels spun faster than I could have imagined. Within weeks, she was facing federal charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy, alongside county charges for forgery and theft by deception. The state bar had already suspended her license. Investigators uncovered that she'd used the same tactics in at least 3 other upscale neighborhoods over the past decade, and refining her approach each time, making more money, and leaving more families devastated. Her strategy never changed: move in, secure an HOA board seat, target valuable properties, then use relentless fines, doctored surveys, and fake meeting records to drive owners out. Through shell companies and forged documents, she'd stolen millions in property value without ever lifting a shovel. I'd come dangerously close to being her next victim if not for my real estate background and a healthy suspicion about those boundary changes. I would have been pushed out like all the others. Civil court didn't lag behind the criminal case. Once they saw the breadth of her fraud, they ordered full restitution for every victim. Her mansion and every property acquired through her schemes were seized. I watched from across the street as yellow tape wrapped around her gates like a slow-growing vine reclaiming its territory. The thief who had tried to take my land was about to lose everything she had stolen from anyone else. I drove past the house multiple times that day, catching glimpses of federal agents hauling away box after box of evidence. The restitution totals were staggering, over $2 million in stolen property value to be returned to victims, plus $500,000 in punitive damages, because she'd spent most of her stolen wealth on luxury cars, jewelry, artwork, and even a hidden Tahoe vacation home. The court ordered the sale of every last asset. My own share came to $1,250,000 for the stolen land, plus $50,000 from the HOA's insurance for the harassment and illegal fines. The $350,000 fine that had started this nightmare was, of course, voided. But more than the money, I felt vindicated. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke openly about what she'd done. Annie wept when I told her the outcome. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "He always believed you fight for what's right, even when it's hard." Claire Morrisseau, the young lawyer who had stood beside me at that tense gathering, became instrumental in organizing the victims and coordinating the civil suit. She even worked pro bono for most families, saying she felt guilty for not spotting Stella's fraud earlier. "I should have realized when she pressured me to sign those documents," Claire admitted. "I thought it was just HOA red tape and not organized crime." The case inspired Claire to start her own practice specializing in HOA fraud. Our HOA underwent a complete transformation as well. The newly elected board repealed all of Stella's absurd rules and wiped out every fine she'd issued over the past 5 years. They even offered me the role of community advisor, which I declined. Bread baking, I told them, is far less stressful than board meetings. I recommended they hire Claire as their legal watchdog instead. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Dennis Matthews began murmuring about whether we'd been too harsh, or whether this was all government overreach. His remarks reminded me that even when justice is served, some people prefer the cozy familiarity of corruption over the uncomfortable truth of reform. A few weeks later, I passed by Stella's old mansion again. Moving trucks idled in the driveway, loading furniture in utter silence. Every doorway was sealed with yellow tape. Seeing that once grand house, once a monument to stolen influence, now vacant and sealed off, was something I never needed to witness twice in my life. The court sold it to the Johnsons, a family with 3 kids who'd been searching for a home in our neighborhood for years but were priced out by inflated rates. They got it for barely more than half its market value, and the first thing they did was tear down that illegal fence. Here's something I've rarely shared. During the most intense stretch of the legal fight, I didn't bake a single loaf for 3 weeks. My oven sat untouched, silent. That's when I learned that justice isn't only about bravery, it takes its toll, too. The battle cost me something I loved, even if just for a while. But when I finally fired up the oven again and pulled out my first sourdough after everything ended, it was the most satisfying bread I'd ever made. Maybe because it came from hands that were finally free. I used part of my restitution to expand my bakery. I hired 2 local teens as apprentices and invested in professional equipment that tripled my output. But the bigger win was in spirit. I was no longer just the guy who stood up to the HOA. I had become living proof that an ordinary person could push back against corruption and come out victorious. Neighbors began asking me for advice on local disputes, and before I knew it, I'd stumbled into being a community figure, not the type to sit in endless meetings, but the kind who shows up with warm bread when someone's in trouble. Meanwhile, Stella's lawyers were already exploring a plea deal, facing federal prison time and staggering civil judgments. She didn't have much leverage. Word spread that she was giving up names and evidence about corruption in other HOA groups, helping uncover similar scams statewide. Even if her sentence might be trimmed, she was still staring down serious prison years. The FBI contacted me again, not just with thanks, but to request a formal witness statement for their larger investigation. This was no longer just a neighborhood battle, it had turned into a statewide, federal pursuit. Not long after, I was preparing for the grand reopening of my bakery, now proudly renamed Justice Bakery, when an unexpected visitor arrived. I noticed an older man, maybe in his 60s, step out of a dented Honda Civic, holding a bottle of Vermont maple syrup. "Thought your cake could use something sticky," he said with a faint smile. Then he introduced himself. Robert, Stella's ex-husband. My first instinct was to shut the door, but there was something in his tired smile that made me let him in. I heard about everything, and I think you should know why she was so fixated on your land, he began. He seemed genuinely weighed down by guilt, like he'd been carrying it for years. Over coffee at my kitchen table, he explained the root of her scheme. Years ago, Stella had dug up an old geological survey from the 1970s in some dusty county archive. She convinced herself there was oil beneath my property, and she spent years trying to claim it. Robert paused, shaking his head in disbelief. She'd say, he doesn't know he's sitting on a gold mine. But you weren't sitting on gold, just your own land. And now she's sitting in prison over riches that never existed. It was almost too absurd to believe. All those crimes, all that destruction, over oil that wasn't there. A modern survey had proven there were no deposits anywhere nearby. Robert even pulled out a faded, outdated report that had sparked it all. I told her it was unreliable, he said quietly. That's partly why I divorced her. She got obsessed with one scheme after another: day trading, crypto, and then this land grab. She stopped living in reality. He looked around my kitchen, taking in the scent of fresh bread and the recipe cards taped to the walls. You built something real here, he said. She never understood the worth of honest work and community. By then, the criminal trial had wrapped, and the outcome had been exactly what I'd hoped for and more. Stella had pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy, in exchange for a reduced sentence. Stella was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison with no chance of parole. The judge didn't hold back, calling her actions a calculated betrayal of community trust that tore apart the lives of innocent families. Even her own lawyer seemed appalled by the scale of what she'd done. No one visits her, Robert said quietly, staring into his coffee. She burned every bridge she had chasing money that was never real. Even her sister refuses to answer her calls. His eyes drifted toward the empty lot where Stella's mansion once stood. I just want you to know, a broken bar. This was never truly about you, he continued. It was about greed, desperation, and a complete detachment from reality. She saw dollar signs where most people see homes, neighborhoods, and community. As he prepared to leave, we stepped outside together. That's when we saw the Johnsons' youngest daughter coming up my walkway with a small wicker basket. Mr. Henry, she called, grinning, I made cookies for you. Inside were clay cookies she'd shaped in art class, painted in cheerful colors, completely inedible, but priceless all the same. No yeast, no filling, just the tiny fingerprints of a child. A reminder that small hands can carry things far more valuable than money, oil, or stolen deeds. She ran back to her yard, where her parents were putting up a swing set in the space once taken by Stella's illegal fence. The sight of children laughing where greed once ruled felt like the perfect closing chapter to the ordeal. Robert smiled for the first time since arriving. That's what Stella never got, he said. Some things are worth more than any survey or scheme could ever promise. That evening, I stood behind the counter at Justice Bakery, serving fresh loaves and pastries as neighbors gathered in the courtyard. Where Stella's illegal garage once stood, kids now played in a community garden. Annie was there too, teaching young mothers her grandmother's recipe for apple turnovers. The whole neighborhood felt different now, stronger, more connected, more willing to look out for one another. Every morning, I see children planting seeds where lies once took root. Flour, soil, sweat, laughter are the real ingredients of a thriving community. I used to believe justice was something that happened in courtrooms, handled by lawyers and politicians. Now I know it can also rise in ovens, shaped into sourdough and passed into the hands of someone who thought they were alone. When you stand up for what's right, you're not just protecting yourself, you're making it safer for the next neighbor to speak up. I've learned the difference between fighting and standing your ground. Fighting is noisy. Standing your ground is quiet but immovable, refusing to be pushed aside no matter who tries. The host still sends me newsletters. I frame them now, they make excellent pie wrapping paper. Maybe the truth doesn't always arrive with a gavel. Sometimes, it comes brushed with butter. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand firm when no one believed you? If this story meant something to you, There's a little thanks button you can tap anytime. I'm off to bake justice by the dozen. See you on the warm side of the oven. Another wild tale courtesy of Anna Dramanest. If your jaw's on the floor, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay.